People keep asking me if I lost it, if I threw something, if I said things I couldn't take back, and every time I hear that question, I almost want to laugh. Because the truth is, I didn't raise my voice once. Not once. And I think that scared my son more than anything else I could have done. I want to be clear about something before I get into this. I'm not telling this story because I'm angry. I'm past angry. I'm telling it because I know there are other fathers out there, men my age, men who built everything from nothing, men who gave until it hurt, and some of them are sitting right now in a house that feels wrong, with a gut feeling they can't name. This is for them. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years in heavy equipment sales across Northern Ontario and Manitoba, and I built a life I was genuinely proud of. My wife, Carol, she was the one who made the house feel like a home. She's the kind of woman who remembers everyone's birthday, who keeps a spare key for the neighbors, who will drive 45 minutes in a February snowstorm to bring soup to someone who's sick. That's who she is. That's who she has always been. Our son, Brendan, is 36. He works in commercial real estate in Calgary. He married Shauna about 5 years ago, and for a long time we told ourselves everything was fine. I was on a work trip when it happened. Not work exactly, I'm semi-retired now, but I still consult for a few firms out of Saskatoon. I'd been up in Thunder Bay for 4 days, sitting in meeting rooms, reviewing equipment contracts, doing what I've done my whole career. I was supposed to stay one more night, but the last meeting of the day wrapped up early, and my contact there, a man named Phil who I've known for 20 years, said to me, "Go home, Gord. You look like you'd rather be somewhere else." He wasn't wrong. I booked a flight home for the next morning. But then I looked at the departures board and saw there was a seat on the last flight out that evening. Something told me to take it. I didn't call Carol. I thought I'd surprise her. She'd mentioned being tired that week, and I figured I'd walk in with a bag of those butter tarts from the bakery near the airport that she likes, and we'd sit in the kitchen and talk like we used to before things got complicated. That was the plan. I landed in Edmonton just after 9. Drove home, pulled into the driveway just before 11. The lights in the living room were on, which was unusual. Carol is usually in bed by 9:30. I didn't think too much of it. I figured she'd fallen asleep on the couch watching something. I unlocked the front door and pushed it open. She was on the floor. I need you to understand what that does to a person. To walk into your own home, the home you've lived in for 22 years, and find your wife on the floor. She was on her side, facing away from me, and there was blood on the hardwood near her face. Not a little blood. Enough that I felt the room tilt. I dropped everything. The bag, my jacket, everything. I was across the room before I even knew I was moving. I got down on my knees beside her and I touched her face, and she made a sound, a small sound. Not a word, just a sound, and I knew she was conscious. Her nose had been bleeding badly. She had her hand pressed against her face, and the hand was dark with dried blood. Her cheeks were wet. She'd been crying. "Carol," I kept my voice as steady as I could. "I'm here. I'm right here. Talk to me." She tried to sit up and I held her. She said my name, just my name, and started crying again. What happened? When did this start? She told me later, but in that moment she could barely speak. Her blood pressure. She's had high blood pressure for years, managed with medication, never been a serious crisis before. But she'd felt it spike after dinner. She'd gotten dizzy. She'd gone to lie down on the couch and at some point the nosebleed started, and she'd slid off the couch trying to get up, and she couldn't get herself up off the floor. I called 911, and then I heard something. From the back of the house, from the direction of the kitchen, I heard voices. More than one. And then I heard laughter. Not worried laughter. Not nervous laughter. The relaxed, comfortable laughter of people who have been sitting at a table for a while and are having a perfectly fine evening. My son was in the kitchen. My son was in the kitchen, 20 feet from where his mother was lying on the floor bleeding, and he was laughing. I stayed on the floor with Carol. I held her hand. I kept talking to her quietly, telling her help was coming, telling her I had her. The paramedics arrived in about 8 minutes, and those 8 minutes felt like something I can't properly describe. She kept apologizing to me, apologizing. She said she didn't want to worry anyone. She said Brendan had come by with Shauna's parents, her father Garth and her mother Elaine, and she hadn't wanted to make a fuss in front of company. The paramedics came through the front door, and they had to pass the living room doorway to get to where we were, which means anyone walking from the kitchen to the front of the house would have walked right past my wife lying on the floor. There's no other way. Through. Brendan appeared in the hallway when he heard the paramedics come in. He saw me on the floor with Carol. He saw the blood. He saw the equipment the paramedics were setting up, and the expression on his face was not horror. It was not guilt. It was something closer to inconvenience. He said, "Oh." She said she was okay. I looked at my son. I didn't say anything. The paramedics were professional and calm. They checked her vitals, got her blood pressure down to something safer, helped her onto the stretcher. She was stable. That word, stable, I don't think I had ever felt that word so physically before. The weight of it leaving my chest. I told Carol I'd be right behind her. I kissed her hand, and then I stood up. Brendan was still in the hallway. Behind him, through the kitchen doorway, I could see Garth and Elaine still sitting at the table. There were coffee cups. There was what looked like paperwork spread across my kitchen table. "How long has she been like that?" I asked. Brendan said she'd told him she was fine, that she'd just needed to lie down, that she'd said not to call anyone. I asked him when that was. He looked at the floor. "Maybe 2 hours ago." 2 hours. My wife was on the floor of our living room for 2 hours while my son sat in the kitchen with his in-laws, and he did not call 911. He did not call me. He knocked on the living room doorway. Once, I later learned, asked if she was all right, and when she said she was fine, he closed the door and went back to the kitchen. She said she was fine because she didn't want to cause a scene, and my son let her. I told Brendan to wait. Then I walked into the kitchen. Garth stood up when I came in. He's a big man, mid-60s, the kind of man who fills a room and knows it. He put out his hand and said something about it being good to see me, and I looked at his hand and then at the papers on my kitchen table. "What's all this?" I said. There was a pause. The kind of pause that tells you everything. The papers were related to a piece of land I co-own with my brother outside of Kelowna, a quarter section of agricultural land that our father left us. It's been tied up in an estate arrangement for years, and Brendan knows the details of it because I've been transparent with him about family assets. He knew the property existed. He knew approximately what it was worth. He knew my brother and I had been in preliminary discussions about what to do with it eventually. What I did not know, what I was finding out now, standing in my own kitchen with my wife on our way to the hospital, was that Garth had been talking to a land developer out of Kelowna for several months. And the reason they were all here tonight, the reason Brendan had brought his in-laws to our house while I was out of town, was to get me to sign over power of attorney for that land transaction. Except I wasn't supposed to be here. The plan, as far as I could understand it, was to get Carol to put pressure on me when I got back. To soften the ground, so to speak. But it seemed Garth had brought paperwork anyway, perhaps hoping Carol would sign something herself, perhaps just to lay it all out. I stood at my kitchen table, and I looked at those papers for a long moment. Garth started explaining. Something about a development deal, about how it would benefit the family, about how they'd already done their research, how the timing was ideal. He used phrases like a real opportunity, and moving on this before the window closes. He was smooth. He'd clearly done this before. I picked up the papers and I tapped them on the table to straighten them. Then I put them back down and I looked at Garth. "My wife," I said quietly, "is in an ambulance right now." He said yes, he was sorry about that, and that he was sure she'd be fine. "She was on the floor of my living room for 2 hours," I said, "while you were sitting here." He said he hadn't known it was serious, that she'd told them she was just resting. I nodded slowly. I wasn't going to argue the point, not then. "I need you and Elaine to leave my home," I said, "right now tonight, and I need these papers off my table." Elaine started to say something. Her voice had that particular tone of a woman who is used to smoothing things over, and I said very gently, "Please." They left. Then I walked back to the hallway where Brendan was waiting. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. I recognized the posture. It's what he does when he's defensive. He's been doing it since he was 14 years old. I told him to sit down. We went into the living room. I sat in the armchair. He sat on the couch. "Tell me what happened tonight," I said. He told me, and to his credit, he didn't make up too many excuses. He said he knew Mom wasn't feeling well. He said he checked on her. He said she'd insisted she was okay and he'd believed her. He said he hadn't wanted to overreact. I sat with that for a moment. "She's been managing high blood pressure for 11 years, I said. "You know what the signs of a crisis look like. You've known since she was put on medication. You made a choice not to call for help, and you made that choice because you didn't want to interrupt your evening." He started to object. "I'm not finished," I said. He went quiet. "I also want to talk about those papers on the table." That landed differently. He shifted in his seat. He told me it was just preliminary, that Garth had brought them as a starting point, that nobody was pressuring anyone. I asked him if he understood that the land in question was not mine alone to sign away, that my brother has an equal stake, that any transaction would require both of us, that bringing over a power of attorney document without my knowledge to my home while I was out of town was not a starting point. It was an ambush. And if he had helped Garth set that up, whether he'd done it naively or deliberately, he had acted against my interests in my own house. He told me he hadn't thought about it that way. I know, I said. That's part of the problem. I want to be honest about what I was feeling in that moment, because I think people assume I was furious. I wasn't furious. I was something quieter and harder than furious. I was sitting cross from my son, a man I had raised, and I was understanding fully, finally, that the relationship we'd had for the past several weeks was not the relationship I had believed it to be. That's not a rage-inducing realization. It's a grief-inducing one. I've supported Brendan financially in ways that embarrass me a little to say out loud now. When he and Shauna bought their house in Calgary, I co-signed the mortgage because his credit history wasn't where it needed to be. I've covered the gap on his property tax twice when cash flow was tight for him. I set him up with 3 of my industry contacts when he was first getting into commercial real estate. Men who took him seriously because of my name, because of my track record, because of the phone calls I made on his behalf. I've done these things not because I expected anything in return, but because that's what a father does. Or so I believed. But somewhere along the way, I think Brendan stopped seeing those things as gifts. He started seeing them as arrangements. And an arrangement implies an ongoing obligation. And somewhere in that thinking, Garth had found a foothold. I told Brendan what was going to change. I told him I was removing myself as co-signer on the mortgage. I told him I'd be speaking to a lawyer about the proper way to do that, and that I was giving him 60 days' notice, which was more than fair. I told him I would be contacting the men I'd introduced him to, not to poison those relationships, because that's not who I am, but to let them know that my professional endorsement of him was being withdrawn, and that he'd need to establish himself on his own terms going forward. I told him that the financial support, the tax gaps, the occasional transfers that had become apparently expected, those were done. I also told him I was calling a family lawyer the following week to have our estate documents reviewed and revised, and that I would be making some changes there as well. I said all of this quietly, no raised voice, no profanity. I looked him in the eye the entire time. When I was finished, he asked me if I was serious. Completely, I said. He told me I was overreacting, that this was about one night, one situation that got handled badly, and that I was blowing it out of proportion. I said, "The land deal didn't start tonight, Brendan. Your mother lying on the floor isn't a one-time mistake. This has been building for a long time, and tonight just made it impossible for me to keep looking away." He didn't have much to say to that. I told him I was going to the hospital. I told him he could let himself out. And I told him, and I meant this, and I want to be clear that I meant it, that I loved him, that he was my son, and that none of that was changing. But love doesn't mean unlimited access to everything I've built. Love doesn't mean I pretend I didn't see what I saw. I drove to the hospital. Carol was in a room, blood pressure coming down, on a monitor, looking pale but alert. When she saw me come through the door, she started crying. I pulled a chair up beside her bed and held her hand, and I didn't say much. I didn't need to. She asked me what happened with Brendan. I told her we'd talked. She looked at me for a long moment with that particular look she has. The one that means she knows more than she's saying, and she nodded. She stayed one night for observation. Her blood pressure stabilized. The doctors adjusted her medication slightly and gave us a list of signs to watch for, things that should send us back in immediately. I took notes. I read everything twice. The drive home the next day, she sat in the passenger seat watching the highway go by. After a while, she said, "You know this isn't just about tonight." "I know," I said. "I should have said something sooner," she said. "About Garth. About the way things have been going." I told her she had nothing to apologize for. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Do you think he'll come around, Brendan?" I thought about it honestly. "I think he has the capacity to," I said. "Whether he does is up to him." It's been 2 months now. Brendan called about 3 weeks after that night. It wasn't a comfortable conversation, but it was a real one. He didn't apologize for everything. He apologized for the night, for not calling for help, for that specifically, and I accepted it because I believe he meant it. The other things, the land deal, the entitlement that had quietly grown up between us, we're still working through that. It'll take time. I'm not in a rush. What I know is this: Carol is home. She's doing her Tuesday morning water aerobics again. She made a double batch of butter tarts last week and brought half of them next door because the neighbor had a tough month. She is, in every way that matters, herself. And I sit some evenings in the kitchen with my coffee going cold, and I think about that night, about walking through my phone front door, about what I found on the other side of it. About 8 minutes on the floor with the woman I married 38 years ago, talking to her quietly, keeping her with me until help arrived. People ask me if I have regrets, if I was too hard on him, if maybe I should have given him more of a chance to explain. Here's what I'll say to that. The moment I walked through that door, my only job was my wife. Everything else, the anger, the confrontation, the decisions, all of that could wait. And it did wait. I got her to safety first. I made sure she was taken care of first. Then, and only then, did I deal with everything else. That's not something I had to think about. It's just who I am. And at 63 years old, after everything, I can tell you that knowing who you are, really knowing in a moment when it matters, that's the only thing that makes the rest of it bearable. She squeezed my hand on the drive home, didn't say anything, just squeezed it. That's enough for me.